I am going to go ahead and share my screen right now. All right. So my talk today is going to be looking at the relationship between superstition and fatalism in the early People's Republic of China. And in particular, I want to examine the disjuncture between how the Chinese Communist Party thought about superstition and how superstition tended to be used by ordinary people. So while the Chinese Communist Party tended to denigrate superstitious activities, things like fortune telling, astrology, shamanism, so on and so forth, because they claimed that it led to passivity and resignation and fatalism in the face of hardship. What I want to argue is that in reality, ordinary people typically relied on superstitious practices in order to improve their lives for the better. The problem was that they tended to use these superstitious activities in ways that conflicted with what the party wanted them to do. So in the fall of 1954, a devastating flood struck central China. Entire fields were decimated, homes were washed away, and countless humans and animals were drowned in the rising waters. Now, once the rains abated, officials from the Chinese Communist Party descended on the region to do things like build dikes and dams and to try to salvage whatever property they could. But despite their quick reaction to the flood, party cadres were dismayed at how the locals had responded. As cadres reported, local residents had refused to help in the recovery effort. Convinced that the flood had been preordained by the gods, the villagers argued that there had been no way to avert it and no way to counteract any future disasters of the sort. Now, this anecdote, which I found in a 1956 propaganda manual called "What's the Deal with Divination, Fortune Telling, Face Reading, and Feng Shui," was just one of countless examples the Chinese Communist Party gave to convince the Chinese people to give up their belief in superstition. For the CCP, superstition was one of the most dangerous phenomena facing the establishment of a modern socialist China. Not only were superstitious beliefs seen as incompatible with science and modernity, but perhaps even more problematically for the party, superstition was viewed by the communist leadership as leading to fatalism and resignation. So in the example of the 1954 flood, party cadres were highly concerned by the fact that villagers didn't seem to want to fight back against natural disasters or attempt to prevent them from happening again in the first place. Instead, villagers just appeared resigned to their fates. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the CCP published a continuous slew of propaganda materials that linked superstition to fatalism. And in a way, they were simply building on a long history of stereotypes that condemned the Chinese people for being just sort of culturally and innately fatalist. As early as the 18th century, Western missionaries who traveled to China described the Chinese as completely enthralled to the gods and the heavens. One writer, an American named John Stuart Thompson, who published a book in 1909 simply titled "The Chinese," described the Chinese people as pretty generally fatalist or believers in inevitable destiny. Thompson supported his point by invoking the large number of fires that destroyed people's homes each year, ostensibly due to the lighting of incense. The fires, he claimed, were the result of that, quote, stupid belief in fatalism, which tends to paralyze effort and to banish caution. By the early 20th century, Chinese intellectuals had completely internalized these accusations. If China seemed backward and regressive in comparison to the Western world and Japan, then it was largely a result of Chinese passivity and almost universal belief in predestination, something that, quote, prevented the Chinese people from developing a spirit of struggle. Beginning in the 1920s, the Nationalist Party began to issue prohibitions against things like fortune telling, divination, shamanism, and astrology as a way to convince the Chinese people to give up their superstitions and join the ranks of modern civilization instead. For the Nationalists, fatalism wasn't just an intrinsic characteristic of the Chinese, but a very real threat to the future of the Chinese nation. Now, it wouldn't be until the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, however, that the discourse linking superstition to fatalism would reach its height. For the CCP, the real problem with superstition was that it impeded the advance of socialism and prevented the Chinese masses from trying to overturn the status quo. One government cadre who participated in the 1950 land reform campaign observed how most of the peasants under his jurisdiction refused to engage in class struggle because they feared that it would anger the gods. Some even insisted on returning their newly acquired lands back to the landlords because they were convinced that they would suffer heavenly retribution for having gained wealth that they hadn't been fated to obtain. Outside wealth doesn't come to those who are fated to be poor, they claimed. And the CCP could not convince them otherwise. So for the Chinese Communist Party, fatalism was getting in the way of the new world order that they were hoping to achieve. Now, to combat the problem, the CCP published just a relentless stream of propaganda materials, like the one that I've put on the screen here, that were intended to disabuse the Chinese people of their superstitions and their fatalist beliefs. Now, many of these materials drew on potentially apocryphal tales, but these tales were meant to sort of scare the Chinese masses into giving up their superstitions. So some government cadres interviewed former fortune tellers as a way to sort of expose the tricks that they had used to make people believe that they could read the future. Others of these tales revealed how superstitious beliefs could lead to things like poverty, madness, and even death. In one case, which was described in a 1964 book called The Inside Story Behind Fortune Telling, a 30-year-old peasant visited a fortune teller who told him that his life would end at the age of 31. Horrified by this prediction, the peasant refused to work and squandered all of his savings. Now, when the fated day finally rolled around, the peasant was surprised to find that he remained perfectly healthy. But since he had already idled his way into a state of irredeemable poverty, he ended up going mad. This is what will happen to you if you believe in the existence of fate, these books cautioned. It is far better to put your faith in the leadership of the party instead. So for the CCP, superstition was dangerous because it directly opposed both the ideological and the material advances that the party was trying so hard to achieve. People refused to see doctors if they got sick. I just want to point out that there's a surprising number of images of people vomiting in communist era propaganda materials. But they refused to see doctors if they got sick, doing things like praying to gods instead. They refused to build dams and ditches because they were afraid of disturbing the local feng shui. And people refused to entertain the possibility that a better life could be held out for them because they were convinced that the life they were living was the only one that was available. So superstition, in other words, was a stultifying force. It was one that prevented the Chinese masses from achieving a more prosperous future. Now, to a certain extent, some of these accusations were probably true. There were almost certainly cases in which individuals refused to challenge their lot in life for fear of upsetting some heavenly plan. But as I would like to argue, the simplistic association of superstition with fatalism didn't always reflect a larger reality. Most Chinese people were not just sitting around idly waiting for their deaths or squandering their savings. And most Chinese people also didn't conceive of their fates as being intrinsically fixed. Instead, in many, if not most cases, Chinese people used the knowledge that they had gained from superstitious activities as a way to alter their lives for the better, and as a way to achieve more favorable outcomes for themselves and their families. Now, this argument is borne out by archival documents that were circulated internally throughout the first 2 decades of CCP rule, and I would like to give a shout out to my graduate student, Tao Yu Yang, who helped do some of this research when he was in China last year. And what we see in these documents is not resignation or passivity, but something entirely different. What we see instead is more typically resistance to state authority and a continuous effort to achieve individual prosperity, just oftentimes at the expense of party mandates. And so I'll give a couple of examples to illustrate this point. So as early as the 1950s, the CCP began encouraging the internal migration of urban youths to less populated regions of China, particularly to the north and to the northwest. And what they found was that many of these Chinese youths would invoke superstitious beliefs as a way to challenge these prescriptions on their movement. So in one example in Shanghai, fortune tellers were overheard dissuading unemployed youths from moving to less populated regions of the country. It's not good to go too far away, they warned their clients. The Northeast is too cold and the Northwest has sandstorms. If you go, you won't last half a month. One unemployed youth who had been sent to work in Inner Mongolia visited a fortune teller before embarking on the trip. Now, despite his initial excitement about the assignment, he was warned by his fortune teller that traveling afar is inauspicious. And so he ultimately decided to renege on his plans. Another young woman was counseled that, quote, her luck wasn't good that year, and that if she moved to the countryside, she would not be able to find any suitable employment. As a result, the young woman, quote, obstinately resisted her assignment, telling the local authorities that she had decided to remain in her current residence until, quote, her luck changed for the better. In both of these cases, ordinary people invoked superstition as a way to achieve their own best interests that just happened to run counter to those of the central government. Now, oftentimes, superstition actively undermined the agricultural goals that the CCP was trying to achieve. In Hebei province, a man named Feng Xiutang, who also happened to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party, he had started to become concerned that his family was not thriving to the extent that he wanted them to be. To enhance their health and prosperity, Feng Xiutang hired a feng shui master. And the master surveyed his property and claimed that a well near the local cemetery was harming the household's feng shui. And he basically tells Feng that if he doesn't take steps to get rid of this well, that his family would continue to suffer in both this life and the next. Well, that very night, Feng Xiutang does what he was told, and he just fills the well in with dirt. And government cadres reported on this case. And as they kind of solemnly noted, they said the well, which had only been dug about 5 years earlier, had been built of solid brick and could irrigate up to 80 fields. By destroying the well, Feng Xiutang might have been enabling the prosperity of his own family, but he was undermining the prosperity of everyone else. Now, what was most concerning to the party leadership was the way that superstitious activities revealed ongoing dissatisfaction with CCP rule. If the people were truly thriving under the leadership of the party, then they wouldn't have had to take matters into their own hands in the first place. Now, this became particularly apparent in a series of incidents involving something called miracle water. Now, miracle water was a mythical liquid that was believed to possess miraculous healing properties, and peasants would travel great distances to collect the substance. So in Jiangsu province, as one example, a peasant fell sick and he has this dream that a stone in the local river had instructed him to drink the river's water. He does so and he immediately feels much better. Well, soon thereafter, rumors began to spread about the water. The miracle water can cure the 100 illnesses, people claim. The blind drink it and they can see the light. The mute drink it and they can speak. The bald drink it and suddenly they grow long hair. The barren drink it and they find themselves with child. At the peak of the incident, as many as 12,000 people were traveling to the river each day, coming from regions spanning Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Wuchang. Now, what was particularly concerning to party cadres about this and other such incidents of miracle water, and this is something that happened all throughout the 1950s and 60s, and actually Professor Steve Smith has also published on this topic. But what concerned the party was that these incidents of miracle water revealed an overt dissatisfaction with party leadership. In interviews that the cadres conducted with the water collectors, they heard numerous complaints about things like lack of access to medical care, the high costs of treatment, the feeling that the party had just abandoned the poor peasants, and the widespread sentiment that if people wanted medical treatment, then they would have to go and get it on their own. Now, in this and other such cases, the turn to superstition was not an exercise in passivity, but exactly the opposite. It was a way of exerting control, particularly over the aspects of life that had been neglected or abandoned by the reach of the state. So from this perspective then, superstition wasn't inevitably a fatalist force, but a type of knowledge seeking that placed agency in the hands of the individual rather than in the hands of the party. What troubled the CCP, therefore, wasn't strictly the possibility for fatalism. Equally at issue was the fact that superstition detracted from unconditional faith in the party leadership. Through their pursuit of superstition, the Chinese masses demonstrated that they were capable of acting both independently and agentially in order to achieve the best outcomes for themselves and their families. Unfortunately for the CCP, the activities that resulted from their insights frequently opposed, if not undermined entirely, the agricultural, industrial, and ideological goals that the party was attempting to achieve. Next will be Steve Smith.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great opportunity for me because I've been working for far too long on subjects germane to superstition, though the topic of my work I define more as popular religion, a category that not all of us agree with, but nevertheless it's been focused on the Mao era, and since popular religion is generally defined by the regime as Famine, then the work I do is very closely tied to the theme of the conference. I want first of all to apologize that I don't have a PowerPoint. I think it's worth beginning by saying that if you go to archives in China, most of the archive work I did systematically over several years was before 2013, or I've been back in 2018. The archives were less restrictive than they are now, but the thing that was easiest to get if you tapped in various kinds of terms that might produce material of interest, invariably got so superstitious products, and you get what was really quite intimidatingly boring archives, documentation full of tables of figures, estimates from various county authorities, provincial authorities, and so on, about the amounts of that were being produced. And I took photocopies of some of this, but was pretty sure I wasn't going to be able to do anything with it. But at a certain point, and actually quite recently, so one can sit on things and not quite appreciate the potential of them, I thought actually this is an interesting way of thinking about how the regime dealt with feudal superstition, let's call it better, because I automatically thought in terms of repression, scientific education, efforts to cajole and persuade, and it struck me that actually there was a whole economic dimension to this problem, whereby the state, especially after the famine, sought to limit the production and supply of superstitious products. The paper, however, begins with two vignettes, and I won't go through them because they're long, that relate to the early 50s. And from 1949 onwards, there was a concern to try to limit the more egregiously feudal productions that came from, for example, the many handicraft producers, shops, sometimes small factories, that produce the visual imagery that is vital to popular religion. So I'm thinking of mianhua, New Year couplets, or the many, many images of gods, of heavenly horses sending your requests up to the heavens. There's obviously a vast proliferation of this kind of material. And from the first, there was some attempt to try and encourage the producers of such to stop producing things that appealed in too direct a way to ideas of the gods and the non-visible entities that shape our lives. The problem with that particular category, and I'll talk a little bit about the differentiation of superstitious products in a moment. The problem with that is that the regime recognized that there was an enormously rich folk art tradition that lay behind these. And since we know that the communists, unlike the communists in many other countries, were very, very aware of the potential of using folk art as a way of commanding support for the regime, they didn't want to carry out crude bans of this material. So the attempt was to try and eliminate the more egregious superstitious elements that were visible in this material, and instead encourage a more healthy content, not just visual iconography, but also the slogans and indeed the uses of this kind of material. So New Year couplets were absolutely fine. Things that ended up in the home for domestic worship were not. So there was really quite a sophisticated, I think, attempt to try and encourage the best of this. Much more problematic were the productions of things like minpia, the funeral banknotes that you burn in order to provide the deceased with the money that they may need to bribe guards in hell, or the kinds of images of the kinds of practical material necessities, whether it's tables and chairs or whatever. So this was kind of more problematic. And in the 1950s, there was very little, I think, strategy as to how to deal with this, other than through official propaganda that discouraged people from A, extravagant funerals that involved a lot of expenditure, and B, that generally warned against the superstitious fatalism, to use Emily Baum's term, that these kinds of visual images produce, encouraged. Much more problematic, though, was the vast bulk of potentially superstitious products, and these were the incense, the candles, the tin foil that are part and parcel of domestic religious worship around the ancestral altar, or in terms of images around the kitchen god. So images of kitchen gods were somewhat problematic. These were problematic particularly because they were items of double use. You used incense to discourage mosquitoes, you used candles and normal source of light. You could even use tinfoil for legitimate domestic uses. And during the 50s, this was signaled as an issue, especially in the context where there was awareness, particularly as we moved towards collectivization, that in many areas, the prioritization of grain as the key link grain that was going to constitute the center of the whole policy of requisitioning, unified purchase and supply. But there were many areas of China where historically there'd simply not been the possibility of growing grain to meet the new requirements of the state, and where households had relied on handicraft production of all kinds, but in certain areas, handicraft production on a very broad scale of superstitious products. So this was often sacred incense, for example, or tin foil that was then used in things like funerary ritual, or indeed colored candles that were slightly better than the average domestic candle. All these things were suddenly kind of brought to the attention of the authorities because certain more zealous ideological types within the government were keen to see such communities convert to the production of more salubrious and more socially useful products. And this proved already an issue in the 1950s, and some of the material I present in the paper is, I think, of interest less to us in this conference, but it is interesting because it reveals the ways in which different levels of authority argue out these issues. There's a tendency in some places already in the 50s to try and offload superstitious products through peddlers into other counties. And county authorities object and send letters of protest to their counterparts in County A. But this economic issue really comes to the fore after the famine. As has already been noted, there's a huge expansion in concern with the revival of feudal superstition in the aftermath of the famine. This already predates the socialist education movement, though the socialist education movement then generates vast amounts of material around this. And the problem is becoming worse because the liberalization, relative liberalization of economic policy under Liu Shaoqi, or particularly Deng Xiaoping, is encouraging devolvement of production quotas to the household. Ordinary peasants get back their private plots. Markets are even encouraged. And in this context, there's a huge increase, not only in the production of superstitious items of the type I've already discussed, but a very big increase in networks of supply. So with the permission of not only heads of communes, but also county level authorities. So this is a bit of the state that is operating in ways that are counter to the general policy of the centre. Commune heads, county level, usually supply cooperatives, give licenses to peddlers to go off and sell the produce that's being produced in the area as a way of trying to meet targets that come down from above that could otherwise not be met through grain or farming produce. And what I do in the paper is try to suggest, and I think it's something we should think about, that in this area, I suppose I'm thinking about the Mao era, I suspect it's true of the Republican era too. You have different elements of the party state that have different interests, and there's often quite a lot of tension, even conflict between the two. On the one hand, as Dr. Meng Yang was saying this morning, the socialist education movement sees a politicization of this issue, partly when Yibanda Xin starts to become associated with political enemies, or seems to be an area in which the 5 category elements are active, trying to use the ordinary superstition of the masses to turn them against the regime. But on the other hand, you have the genuine boom in economic supply and production and supply of these superstitious products. And so from the late months of 1963, provinces are required to report in detail on what is going on. And in December 1963, the State Council orders provincial cultural bureaus to report on progress made in suppressing superstitious products. And this triggers a huge amount of activity. In Shanghai, just to give you an idea, the Administration for Industry and Commerce on the 21st of January 1964 endorses a call for a complete ban on the production of superstitious products, quotes, in order to strengthen the socialist front in the countryside, and quotes, to attack and smash capitalist and feudal forces. And this emphasis on the political use of superstition increases in this period. Up to this point, much of the emphasis was on education, getting the masses to understand the importance of some of the things that Professor Baum mentioned in the area of medicine, so the importance of something like vaccination. But although that continues, there is now much more ideological, much more political content to this. And the provinces duly come up with their reports, which are very, very long, very detailed. Just to give you an example, not all of them find this order, this diktat, to move towards a complete ban on the production and sale of superstitious products as very easy. In Guangdong, the authorities were clearly not happy. Their provincial supply and marketing cooperatives. So these are all the economic organs within the party state. Ask some fairly brusque questions. They tell us that there is one prefecture and 2 counties in Guangdong which rely heavily on producing handmade paper. And this is mainly used to make superstitious prints. It asks, how are factories supposed to transfer to other forms of production? How are they to be compensated for their losses? What is to be done with existing stocks? It reminds the Central State Council that a particular feature of Guangdong is the high number of overseas Chinese who come to celebrate major festivals. And it inquires how their needs are to be catered for, and mentions the fact that, I think it's very interesting, our fisher folk are notoriously superstitious, and how are we going to meet their particular needs? And of course, that wasn't an argument that had any kind of purchase for the authorities, but they got a pretty rude reply and said, you know, a ban is a ban. You are expected to move towards this, but they did, as often happens, start out in the document very, very much with a forceful statement of this kind. And then as you read down the document, certain kinds of qualifications are introduced. So for example, up to the Cultural Revolution, there is still a Religious Affairs Bureau, and the 5 recognized religions all have right to the liturgical products they need. And so there has to be some production of incense, usually called shenxiang. And also there is the fact that Buddhist delegations come from abroad to a few select temples, and they have to get a good impression of temples still providing the whole paraphernalia of items that are necessary to worship. So even in this period, as they're steadily increasing a ban, there are ways in which qualifications are made. In one key respect, there was an easy solution, and that was to provide the wherewithal for producers of superstitious products to transfer to the production of ideologically acceptable produce. And in some cases, this did happen. There were even bank loans to help people to do that, usually small factories rather than peasant households. But in some cases, incense producers could start to produce matches, and in other cases, hard paper could be used for, say, toilet paper and other things. But generally, the resources were not there, and indeed, the whole distribution pattern was highly complex, with many remote areas very dependent on the production of these items. And so really the regime increasingly moves from using economic levers to political and physical intervention. Economic levers are used to some extent. There's a complex taxation system which can be used to try to discourage small-scale producers from producing sacred incense as against household incense, but then how do you distinguish between the two? Not very clear. And so increasingly what happens is people are sent out into the countryside. Usually the PSB is behind it, the Public Security Bureau, and they start arresting peddlers in particular, and they start trying to stop heads of communes and county authorities from providing authorization, or sometimes just unofficial signs of encouragement to people to continue to do this. And I think there is generally a slow success in limiting the amount of goods that are on sale. But for me, particularly of interest, I don't know, a minute or two, what was interesting in some of these reports was the countless ways in which ordinary people, and sometimes ordinary officials, get round this steady tightening of the noose. And so, for example, in relation to factories that have been producing sacred incense, sometimes they claim they have now gone over to producing incense for mosquito repellent. Other factories that have been closed, physically closed down, continue to produce their products, and in some cases even apply for bank loans, or even given bank loans, although they're supposed no longer to exist. But what particularly tickled my fancy were the reports on the producers of prints, of visual material. And here you see very often traditional images, say heavenly official and the god of wealth, which is shown, and that's the sort of inscription, overlaid with new slogans. So the heavenly official offers you good fortune, fortune comes down from heaven. Stamped over this are two slogans: increase production, practice strict economy. And of course the danger in Maoist China was always that one wouldn't keep up with the changing political line, and some of this is evident in very, very disapproving reports. One image depicts the unicorn, the Qinin. Unicorn sends you a song. It's been captured with the slogan, long live peace. Unfortunately, this is 1963, when there's a barrage of propaganda against Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence. Even more out of step politically is the overlaying of the image of the unity of two immortals with a caption, friendship between China and the Soviet Union. Hence, well, because of that particular incident. But I think, just to very, very briefly conclude, I think there was some undoubted success in the regime's attempt to limit the supply of superstitious items. The problem was that most of the use of these items was in the home. As I said, some temples that were important for diplomatic propaganda purposes were kept open and were kept supplied. But most of the temple worship could be controlled. It's easy as a public event to ensure that there is nothing too outrageous that went on. But most people could, using mosquito repellent or using candles that were the standard candles for lighting, they could continue privately to conduct their basic rituals. And I think it's much harder to get information on the Cultural Revolution than in other areas that I've looked at. I think if anything, the Cultural Revolution in some ways makes it easier to do those things because there's so much chaos around. But although the factories and the producers may be under really severe constraint in all kinds of ways, there are possibilities to do things through the back door, to create networks between people across sometimes quite large distances to ensure that people get the things they want. As soon as 1978 arrives, everything comes back to normal. So in terms of one of the issues I'm interested in, which is the reach of the state and the limits of the state, one on the one hand sees that the state can definitely interfere and limit and regulate, but its powers to do that are largely physical. Attempts to use economic levers like taxation are very, very ineffective. And once the regime moves away from a reliance on direct intervention, then one becomes very aware that ordinary people have considerable, not total, but considerable autonomy to continue as they have done for many centuries. Thank you.